This is the Moral Science Podcast, and I'm your host, Amber Cazell. In this series, I get to interview experts in my favorite subject, the scientific study of human morality, virtues and vices, evolution of morals, the judgment-action gap, character development, the philosophy of morality, transcendent experiences, researchers' moral biases, cultural values, plus the obligatory trolley dilemma. We are going to talk about it all. Dr. Linda Skitka is a psychology professor and associate department head at the University of Illinois at Chicago, as well as a professor of political science by courtesy. She has been the president of the Midwestern Psychological Association and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and an associate editor of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Attitudes and Social Cognition, Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, and Social Justice Research. She has received numerous awards for her service. Her research spans a broad range of topics, but she's perhaps best known for her work on justice, the precursors and outcomes of moral convictions, attitude moralization, and how each of these relate to political ideology. All right, hi everybody. Today I am with the legendary Linda Skitka. I'm thrilled to be here with you. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation to talk to you.
So Linda and I are going to be discussing her work on moral convictions today, as well as her work on attitude moralization and how that's related to political ideology. And to get started, I'd love to hear about how you became interested in moral psychology.
I got interested in moral psychology approximately in 1990 because I got in an argument with Tom Tyler.
Who's Tom Tyler?
Tom Tyler is a very well-known researcher who is best known for his theory related to procedural justice.
Okay.
That up through, say, the 1950s until about the 1980s, theorizing and research on justice was focused on distributive justice.
Okay.
And that is how people thought outcomes should be allocated, such as whether they should be allocated equitably according to people's contributions, equally, or based on need. Tom and a variety of other colleagues, roughly around 1980, came up with the idea that maybe what people care about more in deciding whether outcomes are fair or unfair is not what they get, but instead how decisions are made and the procedures that are used to decide who gets what. And their thought was that people care more about feeling like they have belonging in the group, and that they're respected by decision-making authorities and so forth, than they do about whether they maximize the material outcomes. And they did a lot of research suggesting that actually people really do care about procedural fairness, and that if the procedures are fair, they're more willing to accept negative outcomes as nonetheless fair. Okay, so like if you lose a court case, for example, you're more likely to think it's fair if you were treated with dignity and respect, you had an opportunity for voice in the decision-making process, and so on. And I met him for the first time, and we got into a conversation about distributive versus procedural justice, and I raised the question of abortion. And why is it that since 1974, the American public does not think that outcome is necessarily fair? They don't accept it as binding. Nonetheless, the U.S. Supreme Court has the highest standing and perceptions of legitimacy of any other institution in the United States, which implies that it's perceived as procedurally fair. And he argued, well, then the procedure must not have been fair. And that if you could come up with a fair enough procedure, we could decide the issue of abortion once and for all. And I thought that was not likely to be the case. Yeah. But that required me to come up with an explanation, therefore, for why I didn't think that was the case. And the explanation I came up with is that people have moral investment in some outcomes. So it might be one thing not to get something you prefer. It might be a whole nother experience not to get what you think is morally right. And that actually started my research in moral psychology, was actually looking at people's moral investments in certain outcomes, like the idea that abortion be legal or illegal, or that the defendant be punished and the innocent go free, and how that served as a moderator on what was otherwise known as the fair process effect.
Interesting. So I'm thinking of one particular publication and study that you did with moral convictions and how people place chairs in a room. Was that your first look into this space?
My first look into this was actually doing a study of a murder trial.
Okay.
Where a defendant, where participants learned, that insiders close to the case were quite confident the defendant was guilty, or quite confident the defendant was innocent, or were deeply divided about the defendant's guilt or innocence. And we had pre-testing that found that everybody has a very strong moral conviction that the innocent must go free, and the guilty must be punished. And frankly, very low moral investment in due process. But we put this to a couple of tests. First came up with a very procedurally unfair trial versus a very procedurally fair trial, and where the defendant is either acquitted or convicted. And it turned out that the procedural fairness of the trial didn't matter if they were morally convicted that the defendant was really innocent.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter if they were morally convicted that the defendant was guilty. The only time that the fairness of the procedures mattered was when there was any ambivalence about whether the defendant was innocent or guilty. But then we wanted to put it to an even stronger test. Okay, how egregious can the procedural violations be? So we came up with a second test whereby the defendant, in every case, dies. Okay, it's either through due process of law and the death penalty, or through vigilantism, that he is killed by the parent of the victim of the murder on the way to trial.
Okay.
And surely that should matter, right? Whether you die through due process of law or vigilante justice. It turned out it didn't matter. Okay, that if you were morally convicted that the defendant was truly guilty, it was equally fair whether he died through vigilante justice or due process of law. If you were morally convicted that the defendant was truly innocent, it was equally unfair, regardless of whether the defendant died through due process or vigilantism. And procedural fairness only mattered, again, if they were ambivalent about defendant guilt.
That's really interesting. Did you ever have the opportunity to take this research back to, is it Tom Tyler?
Oh, yes.
Is he still alive?
Yes, he's a professor at Yale Law School.
Okay, I should know this, but I clearly don't. Okay, interesting. So do you two still discuss this back and forth? Have you convinced him?
We've co-taught a summer session of the Summer Institute for Social Psychology together.
Okay.
I would say that it's been a spirited long-term relationship in terms of how we've gone back and forth in terms of the conditions when people care about procedural fairness versus outcome fairness.
So the next big question, of course, and this does move into some of your work, is how you're conceptualizing moral convictions and what sort of tips the scales for people between what they're morally convicted of and what is just a preference and outcome they would like to see happen in these circumstances.
Well, that's a really good question. We so far don't know very much about the developmental trajectory of how things turn into moral convictions. We know that emotions play a very big role in it.
Okay.
But we do know that within any domain, such as abortion, a certain proportion of people, attitude on abortion is not going to be moralized at all. That some people just have a preference for a backstop form of birth control for self-interested reasons. Not moral ones, and therefore their position on that issue are going to be, on a 1 to 5 scale of how moral it would be 1.
Yeah.
Other people's position on abortion is more based in group norms.
Okay.
This is what people within my faith community believe, and therefore I believe it too. But if leaders in the faith community might change their position on abortion, that person would probably update their position. And they also don't necessarily impose their beliefs about abortion on other people. Okay, this is what people like me believe. And then only some people see it in the domain of moral imperative. Okay.
And so I'm thinking specifically of a paper you wrote, I think it was Moral Convictions, Attitude Strength, or something more like that. So tell me a bit about that paper for listeners who aren't familiar. How is a moral conviction different from just holding a strong attitude?
Yeah, after working on the distributive and outcome fairness stuff for a good number of years, I got more interested in, let's figure out more about what these moral convictions are. Okay, and that work really started around 2005. Okay. And it did seem like one of our first tasks was to distinguish it from attitude strength, which we did. Okay, the whole variety of studies, for example, your preferred social distance from an attitudinally dissimilar other is much greater when you have a moral conviction about an issue, where social distance is defined as like would be happy to have Mary into my family or move into my neighborhood or as a personal friend. And we control for all kinds of dimensions of attitude strength, and you still get unique effects of strength of moral conviction and predicting preferred social distance and then later physical distance from attitudinally dissimilar others. And we did a number of other studies that distinguish it from attitude strength. And over time, we've developed what we call a domain theory of attitudes, building on some developmental theories, actually.
Like social domains, or?
No, it's just what are the things that can differentiate between attitudes that are rooted in preference, normative convention, and moral conviction. And the major things that distinguish both theoretically and empirically moral convictions from otherwise strong but non-moral attitudes is the degree to which they're authority independent. Okay, which means it really doesn't matter what authorities say the right answer is. When you have a strong moral conviction about something, you already know the right answer.
Okay.
You don't need the Supreme Court. You don't need God even to tell you what the right answer is. You just know.
That's interesting. And that's the case even for people who are highly religious?
Yes.
Interesting.
So even some research I didn't happen to do, but some other people have done, is asking very religiously observant Jews, well, what if God said it was okay to eat pork? Would it be okay? Oftentimes they will say yes, okay, because that's really in the domain of normative convention.
Yeah.
But what if God came down today and said it was okay to murder someone? Would it be okay? They would go, oh, no. Yeah. And probably then God wouldn't be God. But so even they make differentiations between things in the moral domain versus the conventional domain.
Yeah, fascinating. So you said that not that much work has been done on the trajectory of moralization, but you have done a little bit. So I would love to dive into that now as well. What have you looked at so far in terms of how an attitude moves from just being an attitude to being a moral conviction?
Unless you want to know the other ways first, that attitudes and moral conviction are different than otherwise strong but not moral attitudes.
Oh, yes, please.
Because that was one. There's about 4 more.
Okay.
Maybe 5. They're also more intolerant. Okay. And they're not bounded by group boundaries. So think about the example of Western feminists, many of whom have a moral conviction that female circumcision is morally wrong. They may have never met any woman who has been circumcised. They may not know the cultural reasons for why that's actually valued in the societies where it's practiced. They might not actually have done any research in terms of the health consequences of it or the consequences of it for female sexual pleasure. They just know it's wrong. Okay, and they're happy to say and engage in intense activism activities to make it an illegal practice in a country where they have never visited, never talked to anybody. Okay, so and that's a strong characteristic of moral convictions, is that they transcend boundaries. You think that this should be universally wrong, it's objectively wrong, it should be wrong for all people everywhere. Okay, and you don't need to gather any evidence about it because it's so self-evidently wrong. And so again, this has this intolerance tie. You're going to be very intolerant of anybody who disagrees with you. It turns out that moral convictions also have kind of unique affective signatures. They tend to have much stronger ties with emotions than the non-moral but otherwise strong attitudes. And I'm probably skipping a couple of other ones that
set them
are just not off the top of my head right now. But anyone interested in knowing a little bit more about that, I have a Impress annual review chapter that is an up-to-date
very cool
review of everything we know about moral convictions so far. And your other question was, where do they come from, correct?
How they develop. And I know you had said that there's not a whole lot of research out there yet, but you've started some.
Yes. Now, I don't know of anybody who's doing it developmentally over the lifespan. So when does it emerge? And adolescence, for example. Although we do know that even young children about at age 4 can differentiate between a conventional violation and a moral violation. But that's about the extent of it. But we've been studying moralization in the lab and what predicts a strengthening of moral convictions in the lab. And in one study, the lead author on this one was Dan Wisniewski. We studied what would lead to changes in people's moral conviction about abortion. And based on Jonathan Haidt's work, we we're focused on the idea of disgust, but also we're interested in the role of potential harm based on Kurt Gray's dyadic model of morality. We're also interested in could this really be an intuitive process, or did it take some form of cognitive resources? And for a variety of reasons, we already knew that incidental cues were probably unlikely to move moral convictions. And on published work that we had done a whole host of studies where we're introducing people to discuss manipulations in the lab. For example, the fart spray versus not fart spray. By the way, don't ever do fart spray in your lab. It does not come out of your upholstery.
Oh, no.
It does not come out of your carpet. It doesn't really smell like farts, but it really smells chemically. And if you really want to do bad smells, turns out there's crystalline stuff that you can buy that only smells when air is moving over it. So we did that one. We got dead rat smells.
Oh, gosh.
Versus Hawaiian breeze. We had people up to their elbows in Elmer's glue and gummy worms and stuff like that to instigate disgust versus feathers and beads. We had people remember autobiographical experiences of disgust, fear, happiness, anger. None of these kinds of incidental disgust things or affect or physiological arousal things were moving around people's moral convictions at all. But they do tend to move around severity of moral judgment, or at least in some cases. So we thought we're obviously doing something terribly wrong. And it finally occurred to us is that the studies where they do find differences in moral judgments as a function of all these kinds of incidental disgust cues were really novel judgments, right? You know, they were the kind of height moral dilemmas about is incest between two consenting siblings wrong? People probably haven't really thought hard about that, so there was not a lot of baggage.
Interesting, yeah. It seems like it falls in that ambiguous zone you were talking about earlier, maybe.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Whereas if you ask somebody their attitude about abortion or even Social Security, they already have attitudes, and they already have lots of probably emotional and cognitive associations and memory with those, and those probably trump any kind of incidental cues like whether you smell fart spray in the room.
Yeah.
And which led us to hypothesize that maybe the emotional cues had to be relevant to the attitude object itself. So only disgust cues associated with abortion might move around abortion moral conviction. So what we did is we came up with a variety of cues. One set of cues were pictures of aborted fetuses that were very disgusting, harm-inducing, bloody. We came with equally bloody and harm-inducing pictures of animal rights abuses. A variety of disgust, no harm. Cues like pictures from IAPS of toilets that's completely overflowing with feces. We have a lot of fun in my lab. And we also then had, neutral cues. And we came up with a task where we told people what their task was is to differentiate between stimuli that were going to vary in terms of whether they were pictures or words, and that we were going to present them to them pretty fast. And all they had to do was designate picture word. And this was just to expose them to the images. But we did that at speeds that were at just levels of conscious awareness or outside levels of conscious awareness. Okay, so, and if the cue is outside of conscious awareness moralized, that would be evidence in support of intuition.
Intuitionism, yeah.
And actually, if the incidental disgust cues moralized, that would also be evidence in support of intuition.
Yeah.
And then we had this big faux story of a big separate second study where we actually took people's attitudes about a variety of attitude objects, including abortion. And what we found is that people's moral conviction only increased after exposure to the aborted fetuses and at conscious levels of awareness.
Yeah. That's and what did you make of that? Were you surprised, or was that largely what you had anticipated?
After all the attempts to get incidental disgust work, we were pretty sure it was going to be integral affect associated with the attitude object. That if anything was going to work, that would be it. We were completely open-ended about whether you could get it under unconscious versus conscious levels of awareness. We did also do pilot studies to make sure that we were successfully arousing disgust in the unconscious conditions. We gave people exposure to that same set of stimuli, and we had them then rate abstract paintings in terms of what emotion they thought the artist was attempting to depict, and they had a range of emotions, including disgust. People were more likely in all the three disgust conditions, even at unconscious levels of awareness, where they weren't aware of what they were seeing, to say that the artist was trying to depict disgust. So we feel reasonably confident that we aroused disgust in those conditions.
Yeah.
We replicated this study and measured mediators. And it turned out that the effects were mediated by disgust and not by harm.
Wow. Wow. As you're talking about this, it's making me think about, I'm just struck by how rigid these moral convictions seem to be, that they don't move around. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about a lot of literature on situationism, because a lot of literature in morality is focused on how much these things can shift and moral convictions just can't. So what is it about moral convictions that you think makes them rigid? Is it this process of using cognition and emotion? I guess it's a vague question, but I just want to get your take on that.
Again, at least on, the most attitude objects that we've been studying have been political attitude objects. And I think most people have already thought about what their opinions are on those issues, and maybe rehearsed it a lot. Especially if you're morally convicted about it, you probably encounter that attitude object in your everyday life, and therefore it becomes really entrenched in memory. You know how you feel about this issue.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it can't maybe get intensified under some conditions like threat. But, again, compare that to the moral judgment domain. Most people have never had to choose whether to pull a lever to save, one man to sacrifice to five. Yeah. This is not a well-rehearsed situation for them. So I think there's a very big distinction between attitudes that we carry around with us in our day-to-day lives and think about a lot and are exposed to a lot relative to these kind of moral judgment domains.
Yeah. Have you done any work on attitude demoralization? Because it does seem that people over time can lose convictions. Maybe they still have an attitude, but they don't seem quite as rigid on them anymore.
We do have some data, not yet published, on attitude demoralization in the context of the same-sex marriage debate.
Okay.
That, in particular, opponents to same-sex marriage, to some degree, when it didn't turn out to be, the Supreme Court decision didn't signal the end of the world. Right. We do have some evidence that opponents to same-sex marriage did demoralize.
And have you done anything with the process of that? Is the process...
This was largely through affective forecasting failure. Okay, that when the outcome turned out not to be as horrible as they anticipated it was, we saw some decrease in the moral conviction. Okay.
And so demoralization might be just a function of what social norms you're in and how those emotions how you actually feel in that environment at the time? Or is it like it becomes overtaken by associating intolerance of same-sex marriages with disgust and cognitively reflecting on that?
What it turned out to be in this case is, again, people expected to be outraged. They expected things to be bad, and It wasn't as bad as they thought it was. Feinberg et al. Recently came out with a paper on attitude moralization of meat consumption, and they found in some cases they got reactance, which I'm not entirely sure counts as attitude demoralization. We're suspicious, and we actually have just recently theorized that we think that the processes that lead to attitude moralization and demoralization are likely to be somewhat different.
Okay.
For example, the Wisniewski et al. Study with the abortion stuff, that was happening very quickly, very viscerally. It may have required some cognitive resources, but people were not thinking carefully about a whole bunch of material before changing their positions on, or the moral convictions on abortion. We're guessing that to demoralize, however, you're probably it's going to be a really deep cognitive process, and you're going to have to be exposed to an awful lot of counter-attitudinal information. Yeah. And I'm guessing you would have to de-emotionalize it. You would have to somehow dial back all of your emotions about it and get into a zone of moral uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I expect it to be much bigger challenge to demoralize than it is to moralize.
Yeah. So I'd like to shift gears to the relationship between moral convictions and actually taking political action, and just your thoughts on moral convictions and political polarization, because I'm sure this is just a rich environment for you to do your research right now. So what have you looked at as far as how moral convictions can influence social or political engagement?
Oh, we've got all kinds of studies on how moral convictions facilitate political engagement. Starting from the 2000 presidential election, we have collected data in almost every election. First one we did was moral convictions about candidates and the degree to which that would predict voting in the election. We've also collected moral convictions about issues and whether those, hot button issues in the election cycle and whether those would predict voting, and even controlling for strength of partisanship and strength of candidate preferences, knowing the degree to which people's feelings about their preferred and non-preferred candidates are moral convictions predicts voting intentions.
Yeah.
We've done a whole series of other studies that have looked at more people's willingness to engage in activism. And one study I particularly like was done in the context of the lead up to the legalization of same-sex marriage. We did this study when about 6 states had legalized same-sex marriage and the rest of the United States had not, which gave us an opportunity to control for status quo. Okay, so whether people were fighting for legalizing it or for banning it.
Okay, yeah.
Because that might be different. So we got equal numbers of males and females, supporters and opposers of same-sex marriage in states that had either legalized or had not legalized same-sex marriage.
Wow.
And a very, really large quota sample of about 1,500 people.
Wow.
And again, we're trying to predict people's willingness to engage in activism around the issue through a number of different mediators. And we were interested whether these effects were mediated through the perceived harms of not getting their preferred policy outcome, the perceived benefits of the preferred policy outcome. We also explored the roles of anticipated regret at failing to become involved and just anticipated pride at becoming involved. And this was kind of a test of, again, the dyadic model of morality. Was harm going to be, everything, or and then Janoff, Bowman, and Carnes also have a moral motives theory that suggests that morality can come in approach-oriented forms as well as avoidance-oriented forms, but the liberals were more likely to do the approach.
That was Janoff Bowman's conclusion? Okay.
And conservatives should be more likely to go through avoidance.
Okay. And could you expand on what you mean by that for...
Sure. So the prediction there would, if Janoff Bowman's moral motives theory was true, what you would predict is that moral conviction would be associated with greater perceived harms and greater political engagement on the part of conservatives. But moral conviction for liberals should be associated with greater perceived benefits of one preferred policy outcome, and that in turn would predict political engagement.
I see, okay.
So her prediction is that the pathways for liberals and conservatives would look quite different.
Okay.
And in a related vein, conservatives should be more motivated by anticipated regret. Liberals should be more motivated by anticipated pride. Okay, if these approach and avoidance motivations really ideologically differ. What we found was no evidence of ideological differences at all. Everything was the same for liberals and conservatives. And the only pathway that did not predict moralized political engagement was the perceived harms of people's non-preferred policy outcomes.
Okay.
The perceived benefits of your preferred one, and anticipated pride and anticipated regret all predict greater political engagement.
Okay.
And we subsequently replicated that with people's positions on concealed carry on college campuses. Our thought was that maybe that would pull harder for harm. Harm just didn't predict it.
So, I mean, were you surprised by that?
To be frank, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm surprised disgust has been so strong in all of this, too. I guess that wasn't specifically discussed, but it strikes me as funny that a lot of your research is showing that harm doesn't seem to matter as much to people as we previously thought, and yet disgust does. And I'm wondering why you think that might be.
Well, we also didn't explore more approach or other kinds of emotions in those studies. So I think the story here is that emotions really seem to be predicting what's going on. But the story is really complicated.
Okay.
Because other research that we did over the 2012 election cycle studied the roles of enthusiasm for one's preferred political candidate, hostility towards one preferred candidate, fears about either candidate, perceived harms of what they think would happen if you elected that candidate, and perceived benefits of harms of non-preferred candidate, benefits of preferred candidate. And what you find there is only emotions predict increased moralization over the election cycle. Okay, and it's very specific. Increased enthusiasm, you become more morally convicted about your preferred candidate. Increased hostility, you get morally convicted about your non-preferred candidate. Fear doesn't do anything. But it's discussed was a possibility in the study. It just didn't emerge as a relevant variable at all. So emotions lead to changes in moral conviction. Changes in moral conviction over the election cycle, however, lead to increased perceptions of harm of your non-preferred candidate, increased benefits of your preferred candidate, as well as increases in hostility and enthusiasm. So the harms and benefits are coming out as consequences of increased moralization, but they're not antecedents of it.
Interesting.
At least that's one place where harms are coming in so far.
So where are you taking all of this research now? What are you thinking about and researching these days? And
right now I'm really interested in attitude moralization and demoralization. And so we are starting up a new line of research that trying to figure out what are the additional conditions when you can dial it up. But I'm even more interested right now in how do you dial it down.
Okay. And so you spoke about that a little bit. Is there more to add to that? What you said earlier about
we are in early days.
Okay.
I do have some hypotheses, partly trying to just sort out the differences between our work, which seems to suggest that it's emotional, visceral, and easy, whereas Feinberg et al.'s meat moralization paper in particular, they had people throughout, they changed people's moralization of meat consumption largely through an entire semester of exposure to messages in one study. And the other one, it was through exposure to like 7 different videos over a period of months.
Yeah. Could you tell me a bit about that study? I'm not familiar with it.
You know, it was these intense long-term interventions, which kind of suggests, that their assumption was that this was going to be a heavy lift. And it seemed to be a heavy lift. They found evidence for harm in that instance. As well as emotions.
Well, what were they testing? What was the point of their study in the first place?
They wanted to change people's attitudes about meat consumption and to moralize.
Okay.
Moralize the objections to eating meat.
Okay.
So that's a big challenge. You're trying to flip an attitude at the same time, moralize it.
Yeah.
And what occurred to us is that there's a big difference between most people's feelings about consuming meat and, for example, us starting with abortion attitudes or candidate preferences. And that is that meat consumption for the vast majority of Americans is a really strong preference. Okay, and it's associated with pleasure. There's no moral recognition for the vast majority of meat eaters that consuming meat could be a moral issue. Whereas you would have to be completely socially isolated not to have some moral recognition that abortion can be moralized.
Yeah.
And so we're not the first to say that there might be a difference between moral recognition and moral amplification. Chelsea Shine has suggested that as well. But that's what we're starting to think, that what happened in the Feinberg study is that they first had to get people to even recognize the moral significance of the issue before moralization could occur, which I think is likely to be a much more cognitive process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
To really undo people's strong preferences, you're not going to be able to do that with just a flash of intuition.
Do they talk about that process?
No, but it's kind of baked in their assumption in terms of how they the interventions they did, right?
And it was successful?
They did get some, yeah. And through the processes largely of harm recognition, emotions, and to some degree moral piggybacking, attaching it to some other moral value that people already attached. Whereas in our case, we didn't have to work on moral recognition. We just had to ramp it up from like maybe a slight moral conviction to something higher.
Yeah.
And so we're theorizing that those are two very distinct processes, and so the domain of the starting attitude really matters. They start in the domain of preference. We may have had a few people in the domain of preference, but more of our people are probably in the domain of convention or weak moral recognition. And the processes associated with moral amplification are therefore likely to be more effectively driven than those for moral recognition, which are more likely going to have to require repeated exposure to information, a lot of cognitive processing, a lot of harm recognition, and so forth.
Do you think that with respect to political polarization on issues like abortion, do you think that it's possible to depolarize while still maintaining moral convictions?
Very skeptical.
You're very skeptical. Okay. And so from a normative, I'm just asking your normative opinion here, like, would you think the ideal world people would not have moral convictions? They would just have strong attitudes, or?
That's a really that's a really tough question. Moral convictions are associated with a lot of things that are normatively not very attractive, like rigid intolerance, acceptance of violent means to achieve morally preferred ends, which would lead one to suggest that maybe these are not a good thing. On the other hand, moral convictions are also associated with moral conviction, willingness to fight for one's idea of what a more just and fair world would be. I'm skeptical you would have political engagement and really willingness to change social systems without moral convictions. And would you really want to be friends with someone who wasn't morally convicted about anything?
Right. It seems like it's part and parcel with human nature in a way.
Or at least of, moral leadership.
Yeah. So, what do you make of the relationship between morality and intolerance? As a lot of people think of intolerance as a morally negative thing, but I was speaking with Jennifer Cole Wright, who was talking about how the domain of morality is in some ways designed to be intolerant, to kind of get everybody in the same boat as far as normative behaviors go. So,
which makes sense to me. Should we be tolerant of murderers?
Right. Probably not.
And to the extent that we're throwing people who disagree with us on other morally loaded issues into the same boat, there's all kinds of things like, should we be tolerant of neo-Nazis who are exterminating the Jews?
Yeah.
I guess neo-Nazis are inappropriate, but historically Nazis who were exterminating the Jews. So I think that probably our moral intolerance is highly sensitized to try to serve as a kind of way to maintain the moral perimeter of what we're going to consider acceptable conduct.
So I guess I'm curious how you're hoping your research would be applied for the world.
I guess I don't think a lot about that.
Okay.
That this really has been descriptive in terms of trying just to understand the nature of ideological disagreements to some degree, and how they become quite so impassioned. So, and moral conviction was a factor that just had not been explored before. So that I guess the applied implications would be under a case of extreme affective polarization is how do you dial that back? Yeah.
Okay. And what about for basic research? What's your hope for how other researchers will pick up on your work and build off of it?
I do think that the next really big questions are really on understanding the moralization and demoralization processes. I would really like to see some developmental research on it. That when do strong moral convictions emerge? And I'm particularly interested in how moral convictions emerge during people's political development, to the extent that adolescents become aware of politics and controversial issues in adolescence. Which ones are they going to moralize? What function does that serve?
Do you have any hunches about the developmental trajectory?
I wish I had more hunches, but I'm obviously not a good developmentalist. But I wonder to some degree if it has to do with optimal distinctiveness.
What is optimal distinctiveness?
It's a Marilyn Brewer idea that people need to maintain some sense of themselves as distinct from their groups, but also blending in with their groups. And there's a tension there. Okay, so you might adopt the moral convictions of your group in order to blend in, but on the other hand, you might pick one to be optimally distinctive too. You know, that this is one way that I am very different from my group.
So like part of identity formation in a way.
Right.
Very interesting.
And people may only need to discover one or two things to feel morally convicted about, that it might serve an identity function of like, okay, I'm willing to take a stand on some things and not always go along with the crowd.
Yeah. That's fascinating though, because it does happen at a time, I mean, I'm thinking of identity formation taking place in a time where you're also extremely self-conscious and imagining expressing an opinion that is controversial, that seems particularly scary at that point in a person's development.
But I wonder how often it happens as a way to separate from your parents.
Yeah.
That you're going to pick one issue with which you're going to really disagree with your parents and see your position on it as being morally superior.
Yeah. Wow. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate your time and the conversation and getting to discuss this cool research that I've read over the years with the actual source. So thank you so much.
You are more than welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or requests, contact me at www.moralsciencepodcast.com. The Moral Science Podcast is sponsored by ERA Inc., a research and design think tank that's reinventing how people interact with each other. Music throughout the program is My Kruby by Kindswider and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.